Hello, class. Welcome to another video, another session here. We're going to talk a little bit about week 6. Welcome to the week. By now, hopefully things are starting to get a little bit more comfortable for you. Hopefully getting into a routine. We've been doing this for a month and a half now. So I really hope that you've come to discover what works for you as far as time management and assignment submissions and things like that. Sometimes it takes a few weeks to get into the groove of things in a new semester. So I hope that's all working out for you. And if it isn't, if there's something that I can help you out with that, by all means, let me know. This week, we are going to be talking about the rationalizations for police deviance. I did notice that the instructions this week for our discussion board didn't specifically lay out the requirement for a citation or a number of citations, things like that. I hope, as much as we've discussed it, and it's in the syllabus, the class instructions, things like that, that just because it's not in the weekly instructions, you do know multiple citations are required in order to get full credit for this discussion board assignment to get all 20 points that come with the resources section of the grading rubric. If you do need to go back and change something, you can always resubmit your assignment, add some citations. And again, I did notice that a couple times last week. Citations are more than just that section at the bottom of your writing that says references and a couple of cut and paste links or descriptions of books. There has to actually be a citation in the book, or excuse me, in the narrative there, to a book or to an article. It's getting much better. I just want each and every one of you to become the best writer that you can, and by making assertions that you don't back up with somebody else's research or your own research, if you become a criminal justice researcher, then it makes your paper less credible and your writing's less credible if you're making assertions that can't be backed up with previous research. So that's why I want you guys to do that. That's why I harp so much on that specific aspect of writing, because it's so important to me. So when we talk about police deviance or police misconduct, the rationalizations, the reasons why criminal justice employees will engage in misconduct or deviance, comes down to 5 primary reasons that are discussed in the book. Those reasons being denial of responsibility, denial of injury, denial of the victim, condemnation of the condemners, and appeal to higher loyalties. So we're going to just touch on each one of those just a quick bit. And your discussion board post this week asks that you take one of these rationalizations that are specifically built around criminal justice deviance and apply them to academic deviance, whether it be plagiarism or some sort of academic misconduct. You're going to just create a scenario on your own, use your own creativity, and apply one of these rationalizations to that. So just a little bit of a change in pace, but don't forget to, just because we're changing the pace, that's why I wanted to make sure I touched on the citation need as well. So the first one, denial of responsibility. As the book puts it, they made me do it. The book talks about how the victim of the misconduct made the officer do it. I didn't, I engaged in excessive force because the suspect provoked me. That's always the most common way that this is applied. Whether it be the officer was stressed out or having a bad day, the victim of the misconduct, which would be the suspect that they're arresting, started getting lippy, started chipping at the officer, started pushing the officer's buttons, and eventually the officer loses control and engages in excessive force. So that's the typical way that that's applied. Obviously, merely chipping at an officer or talking smack, doing that kind of thing, shouldn't result in somebody being the victim of a crime. Excessive force is obviously against the law. So that's why the rationalization is, it doesn't make it right, but these are just rationalizations. This is how the officer explains why they did it. In no means does it explain that the officer should have done it. Make sure we get that clear. But one thing to keep in mind when it comes to denial of responsibility is that it's not always, the responsibility isn't always transferred from the officer to the victim in this scenario. Denial of responsibility could also be applying blame to the organization. Take, for instance, officers, I think we've all read about officers in the past who have engaged in theft, either stealing from when they go to a radio call and nobody's looking, they steal from a home, or they steal from a car when they impound it, things like that. Again, not right, but the rationalization that has come up in those situations is, well, I had to steal because my organization doesn't pay me enough. Again, that's denial of responsibility. You're just assigning blame to the organization instead of to the victim of the crime. So anytime that the officer is rationalizing their misconduct, not because they did wrong, but because somebody else did something wrong to make them do that, then that's an example of denial of responsibility. The first rationalization in the textbook. The second rationalization is denial of injury. So nobody really got hurt. Again, excessive force is a common example of this. If a law enforcement officer loses control and uses too much force during a situation where force could have been necessary and reasonable, but they used too much of that force, if the person receiving the force didn't need medical treatment at the end, it was just a couple extra punches, or the handcuffs went on and just got squeezed a little too tight when they didn't need to be, or their head hits the top of the car when they're going into the back seat, things like that. Just getting just a little bit too much. It's still against the law. It's still misconduct. It's still deviance. It still shouldn't happen. Officers should be aware of their own emotions enough to pull themselves back or let somebody else take custody of a suspect if they feel their emotions getting out of control. But one way to rationalize that behavior is that if the person receiving that force didn't really need to go to the doctor afterwards, or nothing really bad happened to them, it was just a little bit of pain compliance that didn't need to be there, well, nobody really got hurt. It's just a denial of injury rationalization. It wasn't that bad because nobody got hurt. Again, it's not right. It's just a way of rationalizing it. And sometimes people who realize they've done wrong are grasping at straws and just trying to come up with any excuse. And that's a lot of times what rationalizations become, just excuses. Another way that this manifests itself when it comes to denial of injury is stealing from those who have already committed wrong. So, for instance, if you've ever read about officers who have stolen drugs from arrestees and then either used them or sold them, something like that, the rationalization for that misconduct is, who really got hurt? I was stealing drugs from a drug dealer. So that, again, nobody got hurt, so maybe it's not that bad, is the way that some people are looking at that. The third way is to deny that there's even a victim in the first place. So if excessive force is such a common way to apply these, so you'll probably see that as a theme when we go through this. But if those extra couple punches that we talked about a second ago, the handcuffs going on too tight, the head hitting the top of the car, but you're arresting, I think right now a big documentary on TV right now, on Netflix right now, is the Night Stalker. If you arrest a mass murderer who has killed dozens of people, and you just give that guy just a couple extra shots in the ribs when you're arresting him, or putting those handcuffs on so tight that they cut off the circulation and it really causes some extra pain, who really cares? This guy killed dozens of people. Is that right? No, it's still illegal. It's still wrong to use more force than is necessary. An oath is taken by every law enforcement officer to say that you're going to uphold the law, uphold the Constitution, and protect everybody's rights, even mass murderers. So that extra little bit of street justice is still wrong, even if, in your mind as a law enforcement officer, they deserve it. It's not the job of the law enforcement officer to decide what somebody deserves. It's just to take them into custody and deliver them to the criminal justice system. The fourth rationalization that the book discusses is condemnation of the condemners. So when somebody places blame on the law enforcement officer and they realize they've done wrong, instead of denying the responsibility or denying that anybody really got hurt or saying that they deserved it, you immediately go on the attack on the person made those allegations against the law enforcement officer. So if somebody's condemning the officer's behavior, then the officer will say things like, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what it's like to walk a mile in my shoes. I know what it's like to be a cop. I know what needs to go on the street. I know that, sometimes it takes a couple extra blows, a couple extra ratchets of the handcuffs. Sometimes in order to get somebody's mind right, you have to smack them around, things like that. You don't know what it's like. You've never been on the streets. So you immediately condemn the fact that their ignorance of your job is a rationalization for how you've done your job poorly. Again, not the greatest excuse in the book, but it happens. You'll see that a lot of times when there's a suggestion that there should be some civilian oversight on an organization. And then everybody's up in arms in that organization talking about, well, they don't know what they're talking about. How can they oversee what my use of force policy should be when they don't know what it's like to be on the streets in the middle of the night fighting with a suspect? They don't know what's reasonable. They don't know what's lawful. They're just going to have these policies that end up just hugging a thug is a common term. But again, remember, as a law enforcement officer, you remember the public servant aspect of the job. You are a servant to the public. The public have some expectations for how officers should do their job. And if they want to say in the policies and the laws of how those activities are carried out, then by all means, who is the officer to deny that? Again, I've said it a few times in this talk. These aren't the best excuses in the book, but they're just rationalizations that do come up. And again, I think that's another one that doesn't really hold water once you start analyzing it. The final rationalization being appeal to higher loyalties. If the previous one was a rationalization because they never walked a mile in our shoes, so they don't know what they're talking about, then conversely, that'd be, I need to protect my partners because I've walked a mile in their shoes. So even if they've done something wrong, then I'm going to have their back. Protect our own. It goes in hand with something called the noble cause theory. The noble cause theory discusses, again, it's a rationalization, it doesn't hold a lot of water, but it's interesting to examine it because it discusses how the end justifies the means in some officers' minds. So they will engage in misconduct, but they feel as though if I do wrong for the right reasons, then it's right. Whether it be using excessive force again to elicit a confession that you normally wouldn't have been able to get, and then that confession results in somebody going in jail for a long time. Well, I wouldn't have been able to get that confession if I hadn't just given them a couple extra punches. Is it right? No. Or the idea that we're just going to plant evidence on this suspect. We know they're guilty. There's no other way for us to achieve a confession. In the end, it's going to be okay because we know they're guilty. We just can't prove it, and now we'll be able to prove it. So what's the harm, really? Again, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. So engaging misconduct for what you consider to be a noble reason or a noble cause is still misconduct. It's still illegal. And in the end, it's just a rationalization, an excuse for doing wrong. So those are the 5 different rationalizations that are discussed in the textbook and can be included or should be included in this week's discussion posts. I look forward to reading them. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out. Thanks.